Well, I'm confused, more confused than usual, about nuclear energy and the nuclear debate after listening to the politicians in this country talking for the past week. I thought we might get some smart people who actually know what they're talking about in to have a little chat about it on the other side. So I'd like to welcome our regular commentators. We have Ben Beattie, our energy guru and host of the Baseload podcast. Ben, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Damien.
And Scott Pelto, our economics guru. Scott, great to have you in the bench or on the bench again.
Thanks, Damien. Good to be here.
So guys, it is really confusing for the mere mortal. So maybe if I start with you, Ben, knowing what you know about energy, being an electrical engineer, having worked in the industry as a consultant and understanding things, do you really see nuclear as part of the mix? Is it a viable part of the mix? There seems to be a lot of people who think it isn't.
It certainly should be part of the mix, and it is viable. It's viable in every other country that uses it. No one seems to have any problems with it anywhere else. There's no social license issues, there's no technical issues, and there's rarely any cost issues. So the cost issue seems to be the big problem that the government is raising, apart from the three-eyed fish memes and the glowing stick memes, which I think most of the population is getting a bit sick of now.
Well, I think when people resort to three-eyed fish as their argument, that they probably don't have much of an argument. So
yeah. So they resort back to not answering the question on what their own system's going to cost, and complaining about the cost of nuclear power. Now, it is factual to say there's been some cost blowouts in overseas projects. There's also factual to say that, like Paul Graham, the CSIRO, said a couple of weeks ago, that there's been cost blowouts in domestic projects, Snowy Hydro being a classic example.
Yes.
But unless we're building a nuclear power station underground in dodgy terrain, I fail to see how that applies, right? So
what is the rough cost? I mean, they talk about these new small modular nuclear reactors. What is their bang for buck in terms of capacity and what they cost? So what do you get for $1 billion, more or less?
Okay, so your small modular reactor is problematic to understand the cost at this point because we haven't really built any yet. I think we're looking at Canada to build the first ones, and I believe there's been some contracts signed recently. Most of the coalition's policy and most of the noise resulting hysteria around the announcement comes from the announcement of large nuclear reactors, which are the mature technology that we're seeing built everywhere else. So, for example, a Westinghouse AP1000, which has a nameplate output of about 1,150 megawatts.
So that's 1 gigawatt, more or less.
Basically, yeah. So
Okay.
that's a pretty big unit on the Australian scale.
What does that cost?
I think we're looking at 16 or 17 billion for something like that. So
Okay.
it's quite expensive.
So our total, just to put this into perspective, when we talk about gigawatt output and all that sort of thing, we're talking about the peak capacity, right? Or the capacity that this thing can deliver when it's running at full steam, right? And we need in Australia peak capacity of what? About 35 or?
So our grid demand varies between summer and winter and across the years, but 35 gigawatts is a pretty close number to what we're talking about. So on our hottest summer's day, which will be usually in early February, in the afternoon, sort of 4 or 5.
We're going to chart on that actually. Let's stick this one up, but the peak capacity chart, and you can see it's summer and winter. So it's summer in the orange, obviously, and winter in the blue there. And we're going from 1998 up to today. And you can see it really peaked around about 2007 summer. Would have been probably 2008 summer, I think, would have been the highest.
The important number,
35.
The biggest number is 35.
Yeah.
So 35 gigawatts. So if you had 35 gigawatts of generators installed, and they're all operating at 100% capacity perfectly, and they could meet that demand on that day. Obviously, you need a little bit of redundancy for maintenance, for unplanned outages, things like that. So we always have a little bit more than 35 gigawatts. But we're heading into some pretty uncharted territory where the Australian Energy Market Operator expects us to have something like 300 gigawatts, almost 10 times the capacity that we need. And this is mostly going to be wind and solar. And you need that much to meet the demand because it doesn't operate all the time.
Okay, right. So let's get into that in a moment. But so let's say we start using a lot of electricity for AI, which is going to be the next big thing, right?
Yep.
So if we start using a lot of electricity for AI and we double our need, electric vehicles are another thing, right? If more people start driving electric vehicles, we might need. So let's say it went up to, what would it go up to, 50 or 70 maybe in 20, 30 years?
Call it 200.
Oh, really? You think it could go up that much with?
This is a number that's been placed into some of the latest reports, 200 gigawatts of demand.
Wow. Okay. All right. Well, let's have a look at what we're doing right now in terms of capacity. We've got a chart there which we can put up. So this is quite an interesting chart because, wow, there's a heck of a lot of renewable stuff. The yellow is the solar, the green is the wind, but on the left is today and reality, or well, actually round about sort of the left side. So we're sitting around. The black is black coal, the brown is brown coal, the blue is gas. So.
Now, remember, this is all installed capacity. We don't use it all the time.
Yeah, right. So we've got about 50 now. So
Correct.
we're meeting our 35, okay. Which is basically, so this is basically why we don't have brownouts and blackouts. Okay, so if we get under 35, we're going to start seeing brownouts and blackouts. All right, so let's say we shut off the coal and so the black and the brown go, and you can see it gets to that at around 2032, just in time for the Olympics in Brisbane. And we see the coal's out, and we've got flexible gas, biomass, hydro, so all the blue and greeny stuff there. And then the pink one is coordinated storage. I assume that's batteries.
Well, there's a bit of a story behind that, but yeah, keep going.
Okay. And the big black bold line there is dispatchable capacity, which means this is the baseload power, the reliable power that we can turn on and off.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it baseload, but yeah, it's definitely more reliable than wind and solar. So this is stuff that you've got sitting there that can be turned on and off,
Okay.
theoretically.
All right. And then above the big black line, you've got passive CER storage. I'm not going to ask what that is, something to do with batteries. Then you've got offshore wind in green, onshore wind in green, light green, and then you've got utility solar and rooftop solar. Okay.
And lots of it.
That's a hell of a lot of it. All right. And that goes up to about 300 by 2050 there. So assuming we need that, we are heavily reliant then on the sun.
Yeah, correct. And this is one of the risks. I mean, when Scott comes in and talks about the problems with small business and what's going on in the world, what are we going to power these businesses on? You can't go into a coffee shop and your barista goes, "Sorry, I'm waiting for the wind." Where we don't have enough power right now.
Okay,
so that's a silly example, but this is how silly the conversation's getting.
Yeah. All right, let's turn to the economics of it.
To me, Damien, and from a small business perspective or a user of electricity perspective, what's fundamentally relevant is that the demand for electricity is not going to decrease. I don't think anyone would dispute otherwise. It almost certainly will increase, and we need the capacity to meet that increase in demand. And so, we do the best we can to model the different sources of power and the way we're going to increase that demand. And it's clear today that that projected increases, however they are not necessarily going to be met. And that's very problematic, in my view, very problematic because energy, I think I've said this before, it says in the modern world, it is almost as fundamental as the air we breathe. Without energy, people do not survive, not in the population numbers that we have, at the moment. So
I don't think people realise, right, the importance of energy. It's not just your electricity, it's everything.
Yeah.
Right? Everything that's manufactured, everything that's produced is going to see an input cost increase. The price is going to go up. That's what causes inflation. If we don't have cheap energy.
Again, it's a fundamental point. Energy is in everything, like absolutely everything around us. Anything anybody's ever made, anything anybody's ever produced has energy in it, and so the cost of energy is relevant. So there's a lot of points to talk about in this current debate. Fundamentally, you can't get away from, do we have capacity? And is it affordable? And so, in terms of capacity, there's multiple ways, obviously, for generating energy. But when you put all your eggs in one basket, which we seem to be going toward, renewable and nothing else, that creates a lot more risk. And again, Ben, you're the energy expert, but when I listen to the concepts of baseload, as I believe I understand a little bit, I think most people don't understand the fundamental importance of baseload in a national energy grid. Now, I don't know if you want to talk about that, but to me, that it's fundamentally relevant. And from my observations are that there is no solution for baseload without fossil fuel or nuclear in the mix at the moment. Renewables do not provide the baseload that this country needs.
Yeah, Scott. So different countries do it in different ways, and they use the resources they have available to them. So countries in Northern Europe and even Canada, they can consider hydro baseload because they have the snow melt. It's continuous. It's available all the time. Here in Australia, we have coal and gas. We could literally run our country off gas if we had the policies and the systems to run it that way. Although we export most of it, that's a whole different episode. But we don't have the hydro resources to do it. We do get quite a lot of rain. It's true that Australia's a dry country, but we do have significant rainfall in some areas, but not enough to build dams to run the country. Every time you try and build a dam, someone puts a hand up and says, "No thanks, I don't like it."
Yeah.
And this is one of the problems that we're going to find with the renewables rollout. So our natural resources, some would say, are sun and wind and land. And you go, okay, that's fine. But when you try and say, well, the sun's always shining somewhere or the wind's always blowing somewhere, the argument falls over very, very quickly. So, for example, one of the arguments is the wind is always blowing somewhere, so just build more wind turbines. But I would say to that person, well, please consider just two states, Queensland and New South Wales. If you're going to build the wind, if your strategy is the wind's always blowing somewhere, are you going to build the wind turbines in Queensland to supply New South Wales, and vice versa? And you're also going to build the wind turbines in Queensland to supply Queensland, and then move that electricity? Well, it doesn't make any sense at all.
Well, again, to me, I think having a mix of sources is important because essentially you hedge your bets that way. You should never put all your eggs in one basket. And we know we've got abundant fossil fuel resources in this country. We've been working on renewable sources for at least 2 decades, at least, as far as, in a concerted way.
Well, they've had a lot of help. They've had a lot of subsidy. They've had a lot of hot propping up politically.
And they still are subsidised, Damien.
And they still are massively subsidised. And you've got to ask yourself, why this hyper reaction to nuclear? Why are we getting this response of like, no nuclear? It's like, hang on, this is a bit fishy,
Is it about emissions reduction? Is it about energy security? Or is it just about ideology and people's preferred outcome?
Or is it about business and the fact that people have invested in, and I get this, people have invested in renewables, they want to see the return on their investment. They've got to, right? Otherwise you won't attract investment. Mm-hmm. But I don't think you can say, and it looks like the demand will be there for everything, so I don't think they've got to worry about that. By adding nuclear to the mix, we're not really eating into the capacity for renewables to actually sell their product. Are we?
Well, I'm going to say by adding nuclear into that mix, we actually get to observe firsthand how it competes with all other sources. So certainly when we have a market, and I call it a distorted market, when it's heavily subsidised. So it's very hard to, if we're coming down to cost of supply, it's very hard to accurately determine a cost of supply when renewables are so heavily subsidised.
And this is where everyone's getting so confused, because the numbers that are being thrown around, when they talk about renewables, they're talking about the subsidised cost, right? And then, you get into nuclear and they talk about just the bare cost. Let's have a listen to what Chris Bowen said on the 7:30 report this week, when he was actually asked about costings.
The question asked by Peter Dutton in Question Time today and not answered by the Prime Minister was, what is the total cost of the government's energy plan? Is there a straight answer to that question?
$121 billion is the cost of non-customer-owned generation, transmission and storage, as is outlined in great detail in the last version of the Integrated Systems Plan. That'll be updated later this week, but that's the figure.
So why didn't the Prime Minister answer the question when asked this today?
Well, because the Prime Minister was pointing out that Mr Dutton's got to hide, asking about that when he announced a major shift in Australia's energy mix with absolutely no costings, no details, no respect shown to the Australian people in relation to their right for details. Now, they have been unable to answer basic questions about how many gigawatts nuclear power will generate at what expense. Now, experts have said $600 billion to generate nuclear power, which would be about the equivalent of 3% of our total generation mix. $600 billion for 3%. I mean, what a terrible equation.
Okay, look, I want to vomit, really, because I just find it so offensive that something as fundamentally important as our energy security as a nation, and our military security, which is tied up with energy, is being played with like this in games of political PR BS. It drives me nuts. He knows that those numbers he's giving are spin and distortion. So 121 billion for renewables, 600 billion for nuclear. And he stands there with us. Sorry.
Well, they
I can't stand
certainly.
it. But anyway, let's pull it apart. So go
Yeah,
ahead.
they certainly, appear misrepresented the numbers, and they're not the sort of numbers that we would rely on to develop a business case, say, for different mixes of energy in the country. What we would do, the sensible thing to do would because nuclear is not new to the world. As I understand it, there are, as we sit here now, 32 or 33 different countries with over 440 nuclear reactors.
33 countries,
33 countries,
440 nuclear reactors.
generating power right now. So, China, as we know, has for a long time now been significantly increasing power throughout their country.
The UK they added 80 or something. The UK had plans to add 8. I know that. I don't know how they've gone with that. Last time we spoke.
Well, right now, China is building in construction a further 23 nuclear reactors while we sit here.
23.
23,
Okay.
right now.
Right now. Okay, well, that's good for our energy security and our military security. Why would we need to build any? Why would we need to have any? Honest to God. So, Ben, just coming back to those numbers, just that 121 billion number, he put a lot of qualifiers around that. Just quickly unpack that for us.
So the 121 billion is supposed to be a net present value of future spending on transmission and wind and solar and batteries.
So that's the estimate now, what it would cost to spend this money in the future. Okay,
That's what
121
they're saying. But they do leave out a few things. So when you get into the fine print in the reports, and there was a new report released this week by AMO, the Integrated System Plan, and this is where the numbers come from. They leave out things like committed and anticipated and future projects, things that aren't actually locked into the regulatory path yet. So anything that's locked in, they'll include the cost of that, but things that aren't yet approved, but they are expected to be approved, they sort of leave that out. Now, one of the other things he said, which is interesting, which he hasn't actually said before, is he said the 121 billion a couple of times in the past, including on David Spears back in March, but he said something about consumer owned at the start, which is a really interesting qualifier because in
Not consumer owned, you said, right? Non-consumer owned.
That's right, non-consumer owned. So in the chart that you had before, there was
Let's put it back up.
there was a big
capacity chart. Yeah.
There's a big purple section, and they call it consumer energy resources, coordinated consumer energy resources. Now, what that is home batteries, electric vehicles, and solar panels on people's roofs. Now, if you take the government's estimate of how many gigawatt hours, which is on a separate chart, of capacity in those home batteries, there's something like 150 gigawatt hours, which is more than the combined sum of all the pumped hydro in the country if you leave out Snowy 2, which is a really interesting number, right? That's a big number. So when you look at the cost of batteries now, and they're around about the $1,400, $1,500 per kilowatt hour, you do the maths on that and you add a few zeros and you get to over 200 billion. And now that's a cost that the 121 billion leaves out because they say, well, we're not spending it.
Right.
But to make the plan work, all the people have to spend it.
Yeah, it's completely disingenuous. The question is, what's the economic cost, the total economic cost of the thing?
And they don't want to say.
No, but they'll say it about nuclear. They'll inflate that number as much
They
as
come up
like.
with 600 billion, but this is...
Is that a fair number?
Look, it could be in a worst case scenario, but it's, they're talking about first of a kind blowouts, Snowy 2s all over again, every single time.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully we'd learn from that, right? And we're not even doing first of a kind if we're doing large modular, because first of a kind was done 30 years ago.
Anyway, do we need, look, the libertarian in me wants to say, just let the market work it out.
There's no
let
market
the
anymore, Damien.
investors take the risk.
Well,
Sorry, just a sec. Go ahead, you first.
Realistically, forget the numbers for a minute. Realistically, all you need to know is nuclear power is generated and used all over the world.
And it's safe.
It wouldn't be used all over the world if it were prohibitively expensive.
Right.
It just wouldn't be.
Right.
That's all you need to know.
Okay.
So then...
And if it is prohibitively expensive, people won't do it, and you don't need the ban.
Now, if you...
Right.
if you want a perfect example, of use nuclear, don't use nuclear, I would go to Germany and the recent experiences in Germany. It's a global model for the world to look at. They literally turned off their nuclear power supply for ideological reasons, and now they're in a position right now where they don't have sufficient supply for their country without importing power. They burn lignite coal, which is the dirtiest of all coal. Therefore, their environmental position has worsened. And as a result of turning off that power, their energy costs throughout the country have tripled.
And their military national security is in Russia's hands because Russia has the tap for the gas, as Donald Trump pointed out to them.
If a country doesn't have energy, they're not militarily secure.
No.
It's as simple as that.
They're not economically secure either.
So Germany has to rely on other countries for their own national security.
Yeah.
So,
right.
Forget the numbers for a minute. Just if it were not cost effective, and you don't even have to for a minute consider what's more cost effective in terms of an energy supply, what's less, all you need to know is it's done everywhere. It's done everywhere.
That's right.
Germany turned it off, and their position went south at a rate of knots.
And we need the power, and we can afford to have it all in the mix if people are willing to invest in it. So let's just get out of their way and make it easy. Any final comments from you, Ben?
The market side of it, I think, is going to be a struggle. I kind of agree with the coalition's plan to build it themselves. Whether there could be some private investment at some point down the future, yeah, absolutely. But I think the market situation is so hideously distorted and broken that I don't think you're going to get a private investor building any baseload power stations in this country ever again.
All right. Well, let's continue this conversation on those lines next time. We'll get you guys back because it's been a crazy news week this week and we're out of time already at 20 minutes, so we don't have time to go into it anymore. But I would love to talk more deeply about the best ways to looking at the energy market in more detail and what is wrong with the way that we're running the system at the moment and whether a free market is going to be better than a government centralised controlled one in this case. And it may be that horribly it might not be. So we'll talk about that another time. But guys, thanks very much for coming in. Ben Beattie, Baseload Podcast is the place to go. Baseload, Baseload.
That's it. Thank you, Damien.
And Scott, you are not published other than here on the other side, but it's always great to have you on.
It is.
So Scott Pelto is our economics commentator and Ben Beattie, our energy commentator here on the other side. Did you know lots of Aussie YouTubers have to make American content to survive? We want to keep producing Aussie news, and to do that, we need your direct help. If you'd like to advertise on our show, please get in touch in the comments below or DM us on Twitter. Our Australian content means we deliver mostly an Aussie audience. Or if you'd just like to help us with a donation, please click on the Super Thanks button that's with the little dollar sign right under the video frame just here. Or just click the subscribe button and bell. That's free and it helps a lot.